Throughout history, superpowers have expanded to unprecedented scale, only to strain under the weight of their own reach. From ancient Rome to modern industrial powers, the pattern repeats again and again. But what actually causes this kind of breakdown? What are the warning signs that turn strength into strain? And how does expansion quietly become overreach? Today, we're at a crossroads. The global balance of power is shifting beneath our feet, and the signals we're seeing now mirror the moments that came before the most influential superpowers began to collapse. This is what always happens before overreach becomes collapse. Are you paying attention? It's no secret that the United States is facing a turning point. As countries reduce reliance on the dollar and new alliances form outside the US influence, tensions are rising, especially at home. People are starting to ask big questions. For example, is the US's expansion an opportunity or a risk to its status as a global superpower, especially as commitments keep expanding faster than the economy behind them? Is debt becoming unmanageable as imperial obligations pile up year after year? And how long can the US sustain its global role when overreach turns power into permanent responsibility? In this video, I'm going to walk you through the rise and strain of past superpowers. Superpowers that expanded widely beyond their borders, what they all had in common at their peak, and where the United States sits right now, especially in light of current recent events. And at the end, we'll look at what this pattern means for you. Because while superpowers adjust and systems rebalance, individuals still have to navigate the consequences. But before we get into that, my name is Nolan Mathias, and if you want the truth, the real truth about global finance and economics, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. And at the end of the video, I want to know, what do you think? Could US expansion and imperialism be the downfall of the American empire? Okay, so before we can understand how expansionism and imperialism can be the downfall of a country, we need to understand a few things. We're going to start by looking at the real reason that expansionism essentially creates a financial burden that can collapse an economy and a currency. Then we're going to look at the patterns that always happen. And finally, I'm going to give you historical examples, and there is a lot of them, that clearly illustrate why taking over a country and running it is not always the best idea, even if it seems like the resources that you'll gain are going to outweigh the cost of the conflict. The first thing you need to understand is that even though conflict can lead to the downfall of a superpower, more often than not, it isn't the conflict itself that creates the problem. It's the financial burden that happens as a result. And I'll show you examples of this from Rome and Great Britain and Spain that clearly illustrate this picture. But it is clear when you look throughout history that most collapses don't happen on the battlefield. They happen on paper. They happen on the balance sheet. Because even when empires win and they take over other nations and colonialize, the initial wins can have a human cost and a financial cost, but those wins also create a burden. And that burden, it's often a promise to the citizens of that country that everything's going to be okay. The overtaking country is going to come in and they're going to run things. They're going to run things better, and there's going to be financial prosperity. But one thing that is often overlooked is that every promise becomes a bill. And historically, even though there can be an economic benefit to taking over a country, in the long run, that benefit does not exceed the costs. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. But first, we need to take a look at the overall picture. As of 2024, because the 2025 numbers aren't out yet, world military spending hit about $2.718 billion. This is the highest level ever recorded. In fact, it rose by almost 10% in a single year. And not only that, it's been increasing for 10 straight years. That expenditure, that expense, it equates to roughly 2.5% of the entire world's global economy, which means for every $100, $2.50 of everything that's produced goes towards military spending, which is absolutely crazy. But on top of that, we've also got record global debt. Now, you might think the debt to GDP picture in the US is bad, but when you look at the numbers globally, the total global debt, both government and private, has reached about $251 trillion, which is 235% of global GDP. In other words, the world owes almost 2.5 years of the world's total income, which is an obscenely high number. And military spending, it's a lot to do with this, especially in the US. And the cost alone of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that I'm going to show you a little bit later on are going to absolutely blow your mind. Because in absence of those costs, the US debt isn't $38 trillion. It's significantly less. But these are both really important numbers because it shows that more money is going towards force than it is towards the things that can actually grow an economy. And in the background, that force has repercussions, which I'll show you later on, that isn't just the amount of money that's being spent on the military. It's all the costs that cascade from that expense that last years, even decades. And that combination of there being more money for expansionist policies and more money in the military, and also the debt burden that we're all still living with from previous wars, is making the next war and the one after that and the one after that harder and harder to sustain. And it is this exact scenario that led to the fall of Great Britain, the fall of Rome, the fall of Spain. It's when the initial invasions, the initial takeovers, for whatever reason, but let's call a spade, more often than not, it's about resources. They seem like they're economical at the beginning, but over years and over decades, the cost balloons. And what ends up happening is that the country with the power also has the debt. And that burden, it doesn't fall on the countries that were invaded. It falls on the people at home that at the end of the day are responsible for paying that debt bill. And very rarely do the benefits of the resources that are gained from whatever invasion and whatever takeover outweigh the costs for the individuals in the home country with respect to the tax burden and the economic burden that comes with it. And the irony is that there's a basic pattern here. The maps change fast and the costs lag. When a state expands control, almost instantaneously, like what we saw recently with Venezuela, you have a country that goes in, takes over, and all of a sudden is responsible for an even bigger geographic area that quite often they can't afford to take control of. But in the beginning, all the promises seem like they're there. Oh, we're going to take over the oil. Or in the case of Great Britain, it's about tea and it's about cotton. But all of that thinking is short-sighted because it forgoes the costs associated with managing foreign assets, managing another country, taking care of policing, taking care of production, taking care of managing the economy. So while it might seem that there's a huge upside to invading a company and taking over its oil reserves, there's more to the story than just the profits. And in most cases, the profits aren't even profits. The expansions, they almost always become debt. And what's crazy is that the same signals repeat over and over and over again. Borders get longer, money gets thinner, leaders lean on borrowing, and debt loads increase substantially. And as a result, currencies suffer. Not only from the perspective of devaluation, but also from the perspective of instability and ultimately reduced confidence for investors, for foreign countries, even for citizens. And ironically, it's the strongest moment, the moment of power, that down the road ends up being the ultimate moment of weakness. Because when a country makes a massive reach outwards, takes control of a Middle Eastern country that happens to have a lot of oil, or a South American country that happens to have a lot of oil, it looks like it's a no-lose situation, but the real job hasn't started yet. That's the job of managing and holding the newly acquired asset. And this is where things start to get expensive. Because after expansion, countries don't just inherit the resources. They also inherit the problems. And these are the things that they have no choice but to manage. Things like borders, policing, public services, dealing with local factions that obviously aren't going to want the foreign entity there, and on top of that, global backlash. And there's some really interesting patterns that happen when countries start invading other countries. It gives permission for other superpowers to start to do the same. And of course, I'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. But once countries realize they're in the thick of it, that's where the justification happens and it evolves. The public stories will change quickly to fit the moment. First, it was about liberation. Then it was about drugs. Once we're there, it becomes about law enforcement and order. And then it might shift to self-defense or stability. Whatever the argument is against imperialism will change the language of the justification. And this is where the debates really take shape, because outside observers will debate what the expanding power will get from control. The leaders of the expanding power will argue that it's about resources and liberation. But the reality is that the costs, no matter how seemingly justifiable, are almost always larger than any single commodity can produce. So in other words, an invasion that is justified by economic benefit almost always ends up not being worth the price that was paid. Now, on top of that, there isn't just the costs to holding and maintaining the country. There's also other economic effects, many that come from the international partners and the trading partners of the invading countries, the imperialist countries. First, you'll get public condemnation. It's a violation of that nation's sovereignty, which in most cases it absolutely is. Very rarely does a country go in to liberate another country that doesn't have resources that are to the benefit of the liberators. It's like a trade. If you liberate a country, you expect something in return. If a country doesn't have anything to give in return, very rarely are they liberated. The local problems, they have to sort themselves out in the absence of resources that are attractive to an imperialist nation. Now, quite often, this ends up with allies and foes, and there's quiet acceptance from the allies. The target is unpopular, the whole thing is unpopular, and there's very little pushback as a result. And from the foes, any sort of significant pushback, like involving themselves in the conflict, well, that can create way more problems than it's worth for another opposing large country. So while it's almost often condemned in some way, shape, or form, both from friend and foe, very rarely is there anything done to stop the imperialist nation. And this split is common when power is uneven. However, when power starts to even out, that's when things start to change. And I'll talk about, for example, Britain and the Suez Canal crisis and how the US intervened as the playing field started to level between the two countries, and the US had enough economic power to actually encourage, almost force Britain to stop the conflict. But when that parity of power isn't there, acceptance, whether other countries liked it or not, is very much the norm. But what's interesting is you'll see a little bit later on is as the power dynamic changes, so too does the ability of countries to go into another nation, declaring that they are liberating the country while at the same time taking over their resources. And the math on this is all really simple. You have one-time gains that lead to permanent costs. And nobody ever thinks about the permanent costs. The conflict will be over, we'll be out of there in a year. Yeah, we all know how that plays out. Iraq and Afghanistan are two really valid examples. What almost always ends up happening is that the costs become permanent until at least the empire decides that enough is enough. Because ultimately these empires, when they take over a nation, they're taking responsibility for everything, not just the resources that are to their advantage. So an act that is based around growth eventually shifts to survival. It shifts to managing obligations. And that's where the economics of invasion and imperialism start to break down. Because ultimately, imperialism, it's a system problem. It isn't about bad rulers and getting rid of them. It's about incentives that push states to invade. And in almost every case, the cost of those invasions grow faster than the control does. Because a significant amount of the expense of those invasions comes around actually policing the society when a foreign nation invades and says, hey, we're here to help, but a large percentage of the country doesn't actually want them there to help. So these liberations, they create massive commitments and massive costs, none of which is ever thought out before they actually go into the country. And quite often, if it is thought out, it's dismissed as a 1 or 2 year project instead of it being something that more than likely will last decades. So when you look at the structural changes here, the cost of projecting power keeps going up, more money towards military spending. The ability to pay for it later is shrinking. And especially in the US, this is shrinking substantially because the amount of debt, a lot of it which was accumulated from invasions in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan in the early 2000s and the 2010s, well, we're still paying for that today. And the ability to borrow more to go into other countries, well, those resources are starting to dry up, which means the bill is compounding every single year. And as interest rates go up, it compounds even more. And when you combine that with the fact that going in and taking over a country creates security commitments that don't end just because the leader's removed, but actually start when the state collapses because you removed the leader, well, this is when the true cost of invasion becomes apparent. And it's not in the first week, it's not in the first month, sometimes it's not even in the first couple of years. But in every single case, the holding of another country tests the capacity. And where empires collapse is when the capacity to manage other nations starts to disappear. So one thing is really clear. If you take over a country, you inherit its problems. And more often than not, the only way to solve them is economically. You might inherit ideological problems, but those become economic problems when there's rioting in the streets. So the ability to seize a nation, especially when it's a superpower versus a small nation, it happens fast. But the governing takes time. It's never a slow process. A raid to essentially capture a president of a small country like Venezuela, well, that can happen in hours. But it isn't as simple as saying we're taking over control. Because to put the structures and the systems in place in order to actually have control, it takes years, sometimes decades, sometimes it doesn't ever happen at all. And this is where the problem becomes domestic. It becomes the problem of the citizens of the empire. Because external commitments, they quickly become internal political fights. I can't believe we did this. It's costing too much. How much money have we spent in Iraq, in Afghanistan? We need to pull out the troops. There's some irony here in the fact that the guy who actually pulled the troops out is also the guy who started expansionism again, but that's all for another video. But the common question is, how long are we going to stay? And in the beginning, it might be a year or 2 years. That's what we're told. But it almost always, inevitably, takes way longer than expected. And it becomes endless until such time as enough is enough. And sometimes that moment when enough is enough, well, it's already too late, which you'll see when we talk about the amount of debt that was accumulated as a result of those invasions relative to the total size of the US national debt. But before we get into the US, let's talk about Britain, the last big superpower, and how it collapsed. It started with imperialism. Britain bought a major stake in the Suez Canal. They bought it because they wanted to control the trade routes. Buying it meant they had to defend it, which means they had to expand the security perimeter. In other words, it wasn't just enough to have the Suez Canal, they needed the land and the countries around it. And this became a permanent security obligation until the US stepped in and made it so it wasn't anymore. And the breaking point, the problem, happened after World War II because debt, the post-war debt, became the ceiling. After World War II, the UK's debt peaked at around 252% of GDP. That's a familiar number to the one I showed you at the beginning of this video. This made it harder for Britain to fund the mechanisms that allowed them to control the other nations that were under their empire. It wasn't the defeat on the battlefield. They were part of the Allies. They won World War II. But the debt created from defending their territory in World War II was ultimately the end of their superpower status. The inability to have the financial capacity became the real limit. They still had the military might. They just didn't have the money to fund managing all of these countries all over the world. And this is where things really changed. This was when the balance of power changed. In 1956, the Suez Crisis made the changing dynamics in power abundantly clear. Because the conflict, it not only created downward pressure on the British currency, but it created a scenario where they needed emergency financial support. Well, the only country at the time who was able to provide it had started their, let's call it, teenage glow up. The US was the only country who either had or was willing to finance the bailout. But the fact that Britain needed the money allowed the US to create leverage that forced the ceasefire and the end of the conflict. So while Britain had the military might to defend the Suez Canal, it was the money that ran dry. It was the debt that ultimately caused them to secede to the US as the world's major superpower. And this all started when Britain industrialized faster than the domestic resources allowed. So in other words, they had the capacity to produce, but they didn't have the resources needed to produce the thing they had the capacity to produce. So to grow the economy, it required materials that Britain could not reliably produce at home. This was when imperialism started for at least Great Britain. In stage one, this was all about resource security. They got cotton from India and Egypt, sugar and tea from the Caribbean and India, rubber from Malaya. Malaysia? I don't know where Malaya is. Somebody put in the comments where Malaya is for me. I'm guessing that's somewhere in Asia. They got timber and lumber from Canada and metals and minerals from Africa. These were all nations that were colonies of Great Britain. And it allowed the country that at the time was the most industrialized country in the world to produce the goods that, ironically, they would eventually sell back to the countries that had provided the resources. But then there became the second problem, which is how the Suez Canal got involved. Those resources were useless without the ability to transport them. So Britain secured all the key checkpoints, the Suez Canal, the Cape of Good Hope, Gibraltar, Singapore. And they used their navy to protect, first and foremost, the trade routes, and then secondarily, the colonies and the countries that were supplying the resources. For Britain, this was all about Britain, not about the countries that they protected, but were actually just pulling resources from. Now, where it gets interesting is when the colonies exported the raw materials, Britain would literally manufacture the goods and export them back to the colonies. And they did everything they could to prohibit local manufacturing in those colonies. So in other words, the countries that were supplying the resources also became the client of the production of the things that those resources produce. And this is what kept British factories running at full tilt even during downturns. So when there was pain felt worldwide, it was felt less in the imperialist nation and more elsewhere. So those trade surpluses, all the money flowed back to London, which you would think on the surface means that they would have been inherently more wealthy. But the taxes and the interest payments, those funded the Navy, the colonial administration, and further expansion, which were actually a greater expense, as it turns out, than the actual revenues that were created from the expansionism. And this is how the pound became central to global trade. Interestingly enough, that's also how the US dollar became central to global trade. They were both the biggest buyer and the biggest seller of pretty much all goods worldwide. And this is where the structural lock-in happened that created the problem. Britain became dependent on external inputs, global shipping, and a permanent overseas presence. If they withdrew, that threatened unemployment at home, and factories could shut down. So the expansion became necessary, not optional, but increasingly unaffordable, which ultimately led to its demise. Trade protection turned into territorial control. Commercial interests required military enforcement, and costs almost always rose faster than returns. The initial benefit that they thought imperialism would bring ultimately cost more than it was worth. So Britain lost its empire to cost, maintenance, and overstretch, not to an invasion. Although World War II didn't exactly help, because we all know that that increased the UK's debt substantially, and ultimately it was the debt from the wars that destroyed them. And we can look at other situations before we look at the US throughout history. Rome wanted a bigger empire, and that created money strain. Same pattern, same mechanism. At the peak, Rome's frontier stretched over 5,000 kilometers. Its silver coin, it started at 95 to 98% silver, but over the course of about 270 years, the silver content, it fell to about 2%. This is currency devaluation in the same way that money printing happens today. Then we can look at Spain. Same pattern, same mechanism. They had a huge empire with serial debt failures. They were one of the few superpowers that was allowed to basically go into bankruptcy and continue to be a superpower because there was no viable alternative, at least until there was. They repeatedly stopped paying their debts, multiple times across the 1500s and 1600s. And these breakdowns, they reshuffled who financed the crown each time. The country that got burned lending them money before wasn't going to be the country that got burned by them the next time. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. The other countries weren't having it. And while the empire itself looked massive, the state repeatedly went insolvent. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this, but it was because managing the empire was more expensive than what it was worth. Then there was the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It became a costly trap, and the losses rose, victory stayed unclear, and the cost to take over and maintain it, well, it was so expensive that it just didn't make sense. And Russia left Afghanistan weaker than when they went in. So now let's get to the good part. Let's talk about the USA, the post 9/11 wars that we keep paying for. These wars ran into the trillions of dollars. Now keep in mind the US national debt is between $37 and $38 trillion right now. These wars cost multiple trillions. Even though these conflicts have ended, we're still paying for them as we start new conflicts. And the costs, they keep rising. They keep compounding as the interest gets tacked on, as veterans get older and need more care. All these costs are increasing. And keep in mind that a lot of these programs that care for veterans and healthcare and stuff like that, this is a large percentage of the debt holders of the US. It's the American citizens that the US has an obligation to going into the future. And not all of that, but some of it, it's an obligation to those people who fought those wars, which means even though we're not there anymore, the costs keep compounding. On stage one in Iraq, the invasion was quick. It begins in March 2003. Takes about 125,000 troops. It ended very quickly. But the obligation afterwards, that did not end quickly. In fact, we're still paying for it today. At the peak, long after the conflict had ended, there was about 170,000 troops. Then this started to get reduced a little bit, but the cost of maintaining control in the country, it was expensive. Eventually, the US left Iraq. In January 2010, the troops got reduced. Then again in August of 2010, and until 2011, there was about 50,000 troops remaining. But the cost of this war, there was 4,432 deaths. There was 31,993 people wounded in action. So even after withdrawal, the long-term costs, they still continue. Over $50 billion was used for the reconstruction of Iraq. This became the budget on top of the initial invasion budget. This was the holding bill that arrived after the initial win. But it wasn't the only bill, because Afghanistan's bill was even bigger. There weren't as many troops in Afghanistan, but the costs were staggering, with US forces being on the ground for more than a decade. And as soon as the US left, the Taliban, which is who the US was trying to liberate the country from, well, they just took over again before the US had even completely withdrew. So not only was the initial phase fast, the end was even faster, but the period in between, where ultimately there isn't a lot to show for it for the US, well, that was expensive. And we're still dealing with the after effects. In this case, almost $150 billion was used for Afghanistan reconstruction. A large portion of this was allocated to security funding for policing the state that the US went into in order to take control of. All in all, the costs of the post-9/11 conflicts, they were extraordinary. And I don't mean that in a good way. War funding is estimated at $1.6 trillion for war-related purposes through 2014. But that is just the bill for the invasion. The broader estimates are as high as around $8 trillion, with over 900,000 either directly or indirectly from the conflict dying as a result. Even if you just look at Iraq and Syria, $2.89 trillion is often the number that you see estimated. But let's just say for a second that the future obligations from veterans care and the total cost of all of these wars is around $8 trillion. Well, if the US never invades those countries, and yes, I understand it needed to be done from a terrorism perspective, but what didn't need to be done was the extended stays, which when you knock $8 trillion off of $38 trillion, it makes the US national debt about 25% lower than it is right now. The expansionism and the conflicts, that is a pretty significant amount of the US national debt that Americans are going to have to bear the burden of. So ultimately, this is what always happens before a superpower collapses. The pattern is really simple. It starts with imperial overstretch. It's not a theory. It's a consistently repeated order of events. Rome, Spain, Great Britain, US, and countless other empires. Expansion, while seen as a benefit, ultimately increases commitments faster than capacity. And as a result, the costs compound and compound and compound until the currency starts to suffer, debt becomes so high that it becomes untenable, and instability increases. At the point where another nation has the ability to economically put the superpower in line, that's when everything comes crashing down. Because ultimately, the old saying is true. He who holds the gold gets to make the rules. And when an empire accumulates more and more debt, eventually they have to figure out how to deal with it. And that's when the other nations start to get a say in what the rules are. So it's really simple. Expansion increases commitments. Commitments end up growing faster than the payoff, and the state fills the gap with tools, debasement of the money, weakening the dollar, and repeated debt, more and more borrowing, more and more renegotiations, official pauses of repaying the debt. We see this regularly with the debt ceiling. Eventually, control becomes harder to fund than to justify. Most of the time, it's not a defeat. It's a, we just can't afford to keep doing it. This is the primary reason why the US pulled out of Iraq and then pulled out of Afghanistan. The cost became too much. So while expansion is often sold as cleanup, it's creating law, security, order, the reality is it's usually about resources that aren't going to be able to pay the bill. And the promise of we're going to liberate a nation turns into an open-ended promise that creates obligations that ultimately have the potential to bring down a superpower. Now, I'm not saying that this recent conflict with Venezuela or any that come after it are going to be the thing that brings down the US. I don't think we're there globally yet, but this is the pattern. And the more it continues, the more debt accumulates, and the more risk there is of another country coming in and taking over. And I don't mean taking over the US, I just mean taking over the role as the world's policeman and having the power financially to start dictating the rules, much like the US has done for the last 40 or 50 years. So here's the misconception. Here's what people misread about expansionism. People think that an empire collapses when it loses a battle. That's not the case. The win in these conflicts, that's the easy part. The holding is where the system breaks and ultimately causes a nation to defeat itself outside of a conflict, which is when the moment where a country seems like it is at its strongest is actually the moment where the country is inheriting obligations. And those obligations end up being the thing that destroys the superpower. And while all of this happens, the money can look stable while its real value's eroding. Look at Rome, 98% silver down to 2%. We all know what's happening with the value of the US dollar right now. A state can look powerful while it's literally dying financially. And I think it's arguable that the US financially isn't where it used to be. A country can still be a military power like Britain was during the Suez Canal crisis, but when the money runs out, the biggest military in the world doesn't necessarily matter. And regardless of what happens, the system will still weaken. And this creates a lag effect that traps empires. Because at the same time all of this is happening, rivals start to realize, well, if the US can go into a country and take it over, so can we. In fact, in this case, I think it's the opposite. Russia went and did it, and the US went, so can we. At the same time, the down the road payments, the interest costs, they rise while nobody's paying attention. And ultimately, we're still continuing to pay for yesterday's wars while starting new ones that are going to make the problem worse 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And ultimately, all of this creates an expansion multiplier. It becomes okay again to go into smaller nations to liberate them in order to get their resources. When taking leaders by force becomes normal, other states plan for a world with weaker rules, and that changes alliances. It changes spending, it changes risk behavior, and it changes how countries think about whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea to take their own nation that is maybe nearby and maybe has some economic benefit that they could steal. So ultimately, imperialism is the ultimate debt. It borrows from the future. It doesn't just move borders, it moves costs into the future. And collapse is often lost on the balance sheet, not on the battlefield. And ultimately, empires expand through force, but it isn't a war that ends them. They collapse through the invoices that come as a result. And I've made other videos on this channel that talk about exactly that, how superpowers fail based on economics. But more often than not, the economic problems, they are a direct result of the empire being an empire in the first place. So the thing that likely dethrones the US as the world's global superpower, it's probably not going to be a conflict fought with guns. It's going to be the next big financial crisis. And if you want to see what always happens before a financial crisis, make sure you check out this video right here.